Every week I sit behind this microphone and record a podcast episode, but something you might not know is this is actually my second podcast. I ended up shutting down my first podcast because it wasn't successful. So I want to make sure you don't make the same mistakes I made. If you're new here, my name's Jess and I create videos every single week for business owners like you to help you save time and look good online. By the end of this video, you are going to be prepared to either start your podcast or maybe realize that you don't want to start a podcast. Before you do anything else, you need to ask yourself two quick questions. What's going to make your show different? And what purpose is your podcast going to serve your business? The great news is that there's no right or wrong way to podcast. I just have this simple little microphone sit in front of my computer screen with either a script or an outline and, well, of course, a Diet Dr. Pepper, and record my episode. I don't have a huge fancy setup or anything, though I would definitely not recommend recording outside while your neighbor mows the lawn. That might be something to avoid. The other thing we need to talk about as it relates to preparing for a podcast is equipment, obviously. And if you've been following me for a while, you've probably heard me say you can just start a YouTube channel with your iPhone. You don't need a fancy setup. It's a little bit different for podcasting. Again, obviously, I don't have that fancy of a setup, but you do need to be investing at least a little bit into your podcast equipment. See, when it comes to YouTube, we're consuming content both audibly and visually, so we can kind of ignore the slightly lower production quality. But when it comes to podcasts, we are only consuming content audibly, and so we really need it to sound great. Again, it doesn't have to be super expensive or super fancy. I mean, my mic setup was less than $150. So you can start small. You don't have to go all out, but we do need to make sure it at least sounds good. Now, as someone who has run 2 different podcasts, I do have to be honest and let you know that it can be really difficult to grow a podcast. For one, it's hard to share a podcast episode from your mobile device. Apple Podcasts does not make it that easy. And especially if you're on desktop, then it's next to impossible to share from iTunes. And on top of that, you would think that everyone who's a guest on a podcast would just love to share their interview on their social media to their fans. No. For some reason, a lot of people love to be a guest on a podcast and then not share it. But I will say, you do have one thing in your favor, and that is that podcasting is a much less saturated platform than YouTube. There are millions upon millions of active YouTube channels, and the last research that I looked at said that there are only 750,000 active podcasts out there, which is still a lot, don't get me wrong, but when you compare it to how many YouTube channels there are, that's a lot less competition. Now, I wanted to give you a quick rundown of everything you'll need to think about and have in place before you start your podcast. So first, you'll need to think about your name and create the cover art for your podcast. You'll need to think about your podcast host and whether that will live on your website or on its own website. You'll need to choose an interview scheduler like Calendly or Acuity if you're going to have guests. You'll need to decide what equipment and tech you're going to use to record your podcast episodes. You'll need to decide if you are going to edit your own podcast or hand that off to someone else. You'll need to decide if you're going to do show notes or transcripts for your episodes. And you'll need to create graphic templates to share those episodes, especially if you're going to have guests on your show, so they have something to share as well. Now, I do have some other podcasting tips and tricks over here in these videos, so be sure to check those out. I do have some other podcast tips and tricks over here in these videos. If you enjoyed this video, be sure and give it a thumbs up, and I will see y'all next time.